The conference room in the War Ministry building on Bendlerstrasse was thick with cigarette smoke and tension on that September afternoon in 1939. The conquest of Poland had been swift and brutal, accomplished in less than a month through the application of tactics that the world would come to know as Blitzkrieg. German panzer divisions had sliced through Polish defenses, the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority in days, and the Polish army had been systematically destroyed or captured. It was a triumph of German military planning and execution, and it had validated years of doctrinal development and tactical innovation. Yet the senior officers gathered around the conference table were not celebrating. General Franz Halder, Chief of the General Staff, stood before a series of charts and reports that told a story far different from the victorious communiques being broadcast to the German public. Beside him, General Georg Thomas, head of the War Economy and Armaments Office, prepared to deliver an assessment that would fundamentally challenge the assumptions underlying German strategic planning. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel was present, as were several corps and army commanders who had led the Polish campaign. General Walther von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, sat at the head of the table, his expression suggesting he already knew what was coming and did not like it. The assembled officers represented the upper echelon of Wehrmacht leadership, men who had spent their careers studying warfare and who understood military logistics as well as tactics. Halder began by reviewing the Polish campaign from a resource perspective rather than an operational one. The Wehrmacht had expended vast quantities of ammunition, fuel, and other supplies in less than a month of combat. Artillery shells, tank rounds, aviation fuel, small arms ammunition, all had been consumed at rates that exceeded peacetime planning assumptions by significant margins. The Luftwaffe alone had used more fuel in the Polish campaign than had been allocated for an entire year of peacetime operations. The general presented statistics that made the point undeniable. German ammunition production could not keep pace with combat consumption rates. A single day of intensive combat used more artillery shells than German factories produced in a week. Tank and aircraft losses, while relatively light compared to the enemy's, still exceeded German industrial capacity to replace them on a monthly basis. The Polish campaign had been won through superior tactics and operational skill, but it had also revealed a fundamental imbalance between German military ambitions and German economic capacity. Thomas took over to present the broader economic picture. Germany's economy was strong in some respects, particularly in heavy industry and manufacturing, but it was critically dependent on imports for essential war materials. Germany produced almost no oil domestically, relying on imports from Romania and the Soviet Union. Iron ore came primarily from Sweden. Copper, nickel, and other metals essential for weapons production were imported. Rubber was entirely imported, as Germany's synthetic rubber program was still in its early stages and produced insufficient quantities for military needs. The War Economy Chief presented detailed breakdowns of each critical resource. Oil was the most immediate concern. Germany's domestic production came primarily from small fields and synthetic fuel plants that together produced perhaps 100,000 tons per month. Military consumption during the Polish campaign had averaged over 1 million tons per month. The difference had to be made up through imports or by drawing down stockpiles. Current stockpiles could sustain perhaps 6 months of intensive combat operations, after which Germany would be entirely dependent on Romanian and Soviet supplies. Romanian oil was reliable in the short term, but vulnerable to political pressure and military action. The British could pressure Romania to reduce exports to Germany. Soviet forces could threaten Romanian fields, and Romania itself might change its political alignment if Germany appeared to be losing the war. Building an entire military strategy on the assumption that Romanian oil would remain available was inherently risky. Iron ore presented similar challenges. Sweden provided the high-grade ore essential for steel production.
This ore came through Norwegian ports and across the Baltic Sea, routes that Britain's Royal Navy could potentially interdict. Germany had iron ore deposits of its own, but they were lower grade and more expensive to process. Losing access to Swedish ore would not end German steel production, but would significantly reduce its efficiency and capacity. Copper was essential for electrical systems, ammunition casings, and various weapons components. Germany mined some copper, but depended heavily on imports. Nickel, vital for armor plate production, came almost entirely from outside Germany. Chrome, necessary for stainless steel and armor hardening, was imported. Tungsten for armor-piercing ammunition and tool steel came largely from Portugal and Spain, nations that could be pressured by Britain to reduce exports. Rubber was perhaps the most critical imported material after oil. Every military vehicle required rubber tires. Aircraft needed rubber for various components. Munitions required rubber in their manufacture. Germany's synthetic rubber program, while scientifically advanced, would not reach substantial production for several years. Until then, Germany depended entirely on natural rubber imports, primarily from Southeast Asia, through routes that could be interrupted by British naval power. Food was another concern that Thomas addressed. Germany could feed its population from domestic agriculture in peacetime, but wartime mobilization strained agricultural production as workers were drafted into military service. Germany supplemented domestic production with imports, particularly grain from Eastern Europe. A long war would create food shortages unless access to these imports remained secure. More troubling was the comparison with potential enemies. The general laid out charts showing industrial production figures for Germany, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Even combining German and Italian production, the Axis powers were significantly outproduced by the likely enemies in key categories. British and French combined steel production exceeded German output. Soviet industrial capacity, though less efficient, was vast and largely beyond German military power. British steel production alone nearly matched Germany's, and Britain had secure access to iron ore from around its empire. France produced substantial quantities of steel and other industrial goods. Combined, the Western Allies could outproduce Germany in most categories of military equipment. And, unlike Germany, they had secure access to raw materials through global trade networks protected by British naval superiority. If the United States entered a war against Germany, Thomas continued, the disparity would become overwhelming. American industrial capacity exceeded all European powers combined. American access to raw materials was unlimited. American ability to translate industrial production into military power would take time to develop, but once achieved, American production would create a material imbalance that no amount of German tactical skill could overcome. German forces would face American tanks, aircraft, and artillery in quantities that would simply overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers. German cities would be bombed by formations of hundreds or thousands of American aircraft. German submarines would face American escort vessels and anti-submarine aircraft in quantities that would make Allied shipping routes secure, despite German efforts to interdict them.
The implications were clear and stark. Germany could win short wars through superior tactics and operational skill, but could not sustain a long war against enemies with greater industrial and resource bases. The Polish campaign had demonstrated both German military excellence and German economic vulnerability. If the current war expanded to include sustained combat against Britain and France, and especially if it eventually involved the Soviet Union or the United States, Germany would face resource constraints that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Von Brauchitsch asked the question that everyone in the room was thinking. How long could Germany sustain high-intensity combat operations given these economic constraints? The answer depended on many variables, Thomas replied, but the fundamental calculation was straightforward. Germany had accumulated stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, and other supplies during the pre-war rearmament period. These stockpiles could support several months of intensive combat, but once they were depleted, Germany would be dependent on current production, which was insufficient to sustain prolonged high-intensity warfare. Halder added a military perspective to this economic assessment. The Wehrmacht's strength lay in its ability to concentrate forces for decisive operations, to achieve local superiority through rapid maneuver, to destroy enemy armies before they could effectively mobilize their resources. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it worked brilliantly when enemies could be defeated in weeks or months. But it depended on quick victories. A war of attrition, a sustained conflict where both sides mobilized their full economic potential, would favor the side with greater resources, regardless of tactical superiority. The general pointed to the current situation with Britain and France. Both nations had declared war on Germany after the invasion of Poland, but neither had launched major offensive operations. The French army sat behind the Maginot Line. The British were building up forces, but showed no inclination to attack. This period of relative quiet, which the press was calling the phony war, was actually a race between German tactical excellence and Allied industrial mobilization. If Germany could launch offensives in the West and defeat France quickly, as Poland had been defeated, then German resource constraints might not matter. Britain, isolated and lacking continental allies, might seek peace terms. But if the war dragged on, if France proved more difficult to defeat than Poland, if Britain remained in the war even after France fell, then Germany would face the exact scenario that economic analysis suggested it could not win: a long war of industrial attrition against enemies with superior resources. Several officers around the table shifted uncomfortably. What Halder was describing contradicted the triumphant narrative surrounding the Polish victory. The German public believed their military was invincible. Nazi propaganda emphasized German strength and Allied weakness. Yet here were senior military professionals explaining that Germany's apparent strength masked fundamental vulnerabilities that would be exposed in a prolonged conflict. General Erich von Manstein, who would later gain fame for his operational planning, asked about the possibility of solving Germany's resource problems through conquest. If German forces occupied France and its industrial capacity, if they secured access to French colonial resources, if they could trade with or coerce neutral nations, could Germany's economic position be strengthened sufficiently to sustain a long war? Thomas acknowledged that conquest could provide temporary relief. French industry could supplement German production. Access to French colonial resources, particularly North African phosphates and other minerals, would help. Control of additional European territory would provide food and labor. But the fundamental problem remained. Germany would still lack secure access to oil, would still depend on imports for critical materials, and would still be vulnerable to naval blockade by Britain's superior fleet. Moreover, conquest required resources to achieve, and occupation required resources to maintain. Every kilometer of territory Germany controlled had to be garrisoned, administered, and defended. Every conquered population had to be policed and exploited. The Wehrmacht's strength would be dispersed across occupied territories rather than concentrated for decisive operations. The longer the war lasted, the more German military power would be diluted by occupation duties. Halder returned to the strategic implications of the resource analysis. Germany had perhaps one chance to win the war: a rapid offensive in the West that defeated France and convinced Britain to seek peace. This offensive would need to occur in spring 1940, before Allied mobilization reached full strength, before British industrial production translated into military power, before American support for the Allies became substantial enough to tip the balance. But even success in France would not guarantee final victory. Britain was protected by the Channel and the Royal Navy. Invading Britain would require naval and air superiority that Germany lacked and could not develop while fighting a continental war. If Britain remained in the war,
Even without continental allies, the conflict would continue, and a continuing war meant eventually facing the resource constraints that Thomas had outlined. The specter of American involvement hung over the discussion like a dark cloud. America was officially neutral, but American sympathy clearly lay with Britain and France. American industrial capacity was being mobilized to support the Allies through arms sales and other assistance. If the war continued long enough, American entry became increasingly likely. And if America entered the war, Germany would face an enemy with unlimited industrial capacity, secure access to resources, and the ability to outproduce the Reich in every category of military equipment. Von Brauchitsch asked the possibility of an alliance with the Soviet Union, providing access to resources that would allow Germany to sustain a long war. The Nazi-Soviet pact, signed in August 1939, had provided for trade between the two nations, with the Soviets supplying oil, grain, and raw materials in exchange for German manufactured goods and technology. Thomas responded that Soviet supplies were helpful but insufficient for German needs and unreliable for the long term. The Soviet Union was pursuing its own interests, not supporting German war aims. Stalin could cut off supplies at any time, and probably would if he perceived Germany to be weakening or if the Western Allies offered better terms. Depending on Soviet goodwill to sustain German war-making capacity was strategic folly. Moreover, several officers noted the ideological conflict between Nazi socialism and Bolshevism made long-term cooperation impossible. Hitler had made clear in his writings and speeches that he viewed the Soviet Union as an enemy. The current pact was a tactical convenience, not a strategic partnership. At some point, Germany and the Soviet Union would likely come into conflict. When that happened, Germany would face a two-front war for which it lacked the resources. The discussion became more pessimistic as officers contemplated the implications of what they were hearing. Germany was embarked on a war that its economy could not sustain indefinitely. The brilliant tactical victories that had been achieved in Poland could not compensate for fundamental resource deficiencies. Unless the war could be won quickly through a series of rapid campaigns that defeated enemies before they could fully mobilize, Germany would eventually be overwhelmed by opponents with greater industrial capacity. Halder presented a timeline that illustrated the problem starkly. By mid-1940, German stockpiles of critical materials would be significantly depleted. By late 1940 or early 1941, Germany would be entirely dependent on current production and whatever resources could be extracted from conquered territories. By 1942, if the war continued that long, Allied industrial mobilization would have created a material imbalance so severe that German tactical excellence would be insufficient to compensate.
The general emphasized that this was not defeatism, but realism. Germany possessed the most capable army in Europe, perhaps in the world. German officers were better trained, German tactics more advanced, German operational doctrine superior to that of any potential enemy. But wars were not won by superior doctrine alone. They were won by the side that could sustain its military effort longer, that could replace losses faster, that could translate economic power into military capability. The timeline Halder presented broke down into specific phases. The first phase, through spring 1940, represented the period of German maximum relative strength. Stockpiles were adequate, the Wehrmacht was at peak readiness, and Allied mobilization was incomplete. This was the window for decisive operations in the West. If France could be defeated and Britain neutralized during this period, Germany's economic vulnerabilities might never become decisive factors. The second phase, from summer 1940 through 1941, would see increasing resource constraints. Stockpiles would be depleted or at dangerously low levels. Current production would have to support ongoing operations while also replacing combat losses and building reserves for new campaigns. Allied industrial mobilization would be approaching full capacity.
The material balance would begin to shift against Germany, unless conquered territories provided significant resource gains. The third phase, 1942 and beyond, would be characterized by overwhelming Allied material superiority if the war continued that long. British industry would be fully mobilized. Soviet production, if the USSR was in the war, would be reaching massive levels. American industrial capacity, if mobilized for war, would dwarf all European production combined. Germany would be fighting enemies who could lose 10 tanks for every German tank destroyed and still come out ahead because they could build 11 while Germany could build 1. These phases were not certain predictions, but analytical frameworks based on production data and resource constraints. The actual timeline would depend on many factors: whether campaigns succeeded quickly, whether conquered territories yielded expected resources, whether neutral nations remained neutral or entered the war, whether technological innovations changed military requirements. But the underlying mathematics were inexorable. Germany consumed resources faster than it could produce them, and this imbalance grew worse the longer the war continued. Thomas added specific examples that made the abstract analysis concrete. Germany produced approximately 2,000 aircraft per month across all types. Britain alone was producing similar numbers and expanding capacity. Add French production, and the Allies were already outproducing Germany in aircraft. If the United States entered the war, American aircraft production would eventually reach tens of thousands per month. No amount of pilot skill or tactical innovation could overcome such numerical disadvantages. Tank production showed similar disparities. Germany could produce perhaps 200 to 300 tanks per month. The Soviet Union alone could produce more than that. British tank production was expanding rapidly. American potential was enormous, limited only by the time required to convert industrial capacity to war production. In a long war, German panzer divisions would face ever-increasing numbers of enemy tanks, while German production struggled to replace losses. The most critical shortage was oil. Germany consumed approximately 1 million tons of oil per month during intensive combat operations. Domestic production and synthetic fuel programs provided perhaps 10% of this requirement. The rest had to be imported, primarily from Romania and the Soviet Union. If these supplies were interrupted, either through enemy action or political changes, the Wehrmacht would be immobilized within weeks. Planes could not fly without fuel, tanks could not advance, trucks could not transport supplies. The entire German military machine depended on access to foreign oil that could be cut off. Several officers asked about the possibility of technological innovations compensating for resource deficiencies. Germany led the world in several areas of military technology. German scientists and engineers were developing new weapon systems, new aircraft designs, new armored vehicles. Could not technological superiority offset numerical disadvantages? Halder acknowledged that technology mattered, but argued it could not overcome fundamental imbalances in industrial capacity. Superior tanks were valuable, but only if they could be produced in adequate numbers. Advanced aircraft designs meant nothing if fuel shortages grounded them. Technological innovation required time to develop and resources to implement. In a long war, enemies with greater industrial capacity would eventually match or exceed German technological advantages while maintaining numerical superiority. The discussion turned to strategic alternatives. If Germany could not sustain a long war, what options existed? The answer depended on achieving quick victories in a series of limited campaigns.
Defeat France rapidly before Allied mobilization reached full strength. Force Britain to terms, or at least neutralize British military power. Secure control of European resources before undertaking any conflict with the Soviet Union.
Each campaign would need to be concluded successfully before the next began, preventing the multi-front war that Germany's economy could not sustain. But this strategy depended on enemies cooperating by being defeated quickly. It assumed that tactical victories would translate into strategic success, that conquered populations would accept German control, that neutral nations would not enter the war against Germany. These were enormous assumptions, and if any proved false, Germany would find itself in the exact situation that economic analysis predicted it could not win. Von Manstein posed a difficult question. If Germany could not fight a long war, should Germany be fighting at all? The Polish campaign had been necessary to address legitimate grievances about territory and minorities, but expanding the war to include France and Britain, and potentially the Soviet Union, seemed to guarantee the long war that Germany could not sustain. Was there not a diplomatic path that would achieve German objectives without risking national survival? The question hung in the air unanswered because everyone in the room understood that strategic policy was set by Hitler, not by military professionals. The generals could analyze resource constraints and present military realities, but they could not determine national strategy. And Hitler had made clear his intentions: to reverse the Versailles settlement, to establish German dominance in Europe, to create living space for the German people in the East. These objectives could not be achieved through diplomacy alone. They required military conquest, which meant war, which meant eventually facing the resource constraints that doomed Germany to defeat in a prolonged conflict. Halder concluded the briefing by summarizing the key findings. Germany possessed military excellence but economic vulnerability. German forces could win short campaigns through superior tactics and operational skill, but Germany could not sustain high-intensity combat operations for more than a year without depleting critical stockpiles. German industrial production was insufficient to replace combat losses while also building up forces for new campaigns. German dependence on imported resources created strategic vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The implications for military planning were clear. Every campaign had to be designed for rapid victory. Forces had to be concentrated for decisive battles that destroyed enemy armies quickly. Prolonged fighting, even if tactically successful, had to be avoided because it consumed resources faster than Germany could replace them. The Wehrmacht's entire operational doctrine had to be built around the assumption of short wars, because long wars led inevitably to German defeat through economic exhaustion. As the meeting broke up, the officers filed out in small groups, conversing quietly about what they had heard. The professional military leadership of Germany now understood something that the public did not, that Nazi propaganda actively obscured, that perhaps even Hitler did not fully grasp. Germany was strong enough to win battles, but too weak to win a long war. The brilliant victories in Poland had revealed both German military capability and German economic limitations. The generals who left that conference room knew that Germany's fate depended on achieving a series of rapid victories against enemies who might not cooperate by being defeated quickly. They knew that every month the war continued was a month closer to the point where resource constraints would nullify tactical excellence. They knew that if the war expanded to include multiple major powers simultaneously, if it became a true world war rather than a series of limited campaigns, Germany would ultimately be crushed by enemies with superior industrial capacity. Some of these officers would later participate in plots against Hitler, motivated in part by their understanding that his strategic vision could not be reconciled with economic reality. Others would serve loyally through years of war, implementing brilliant tactics in hopeless situations, winning battles that could not change the strategic outcome, watching German military power consumed in a war the nation could not sustain. All of them carried away from that September 1939 meeting a recognition that troubled their professional judgment and their personal futures. Germany could not fight a long war. And yet, Germany was embarked on a course that made a long war increasingly inevitable. The realization was both clear and unbearable. Clear because the economic data was undeniable, because the resource constraints were mathematically demonstrable, because the comparison with potential enemies showed overwhelming disadvantages in industrial capacity. Unbearable because it meant the German strategy was fundamentally flawed, that the war might be unwinnable regardless of tactical successes, that Germany was heading toward a catastrophe that could be foreseen but apparently could not be prevented. In the years ahead, these generals would watch their analysis proved correct in painful detail. The quick victory in France in 1940 would be followed by Britain's refusal to surrender. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 would fail to achieve the rapid victory that economic constraints demanded. American entry into the war in late 1941 would create exactly the coalition of industrial powers that Germany could not defeat. By 1943, German forces would be fighting on multiple fronts while facing enemies who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The officers who filed out of that conference room carried with them a knowledge that was both professionally valuable and personally troubling. They knew that Germany's military excellence masked economic weakness. They knew that each tactical victory consumed irreplaceable resources. They knew that time was Germany's enemy, that every month of war brought the nation closer to the point where resource constraints would nullify operational skill. Some of these men would remain loyal to the regime despite their understanding of its strategic impossibility. They would continue to serve, implementing brilliant tactics in hopeless situations, winning battles that could not change the strategic outcome, watching German military power consumed in a war the nation could not sustain. Others would eventually turn against Hitler, participating in resistance networks or assassination plots motivated partly by their recognition that Nazi strategy would lead to Germany's destruction.
Officers who understood that Germany could not win a long war would eventually conclude that removing Hitler was the only way to end a war that was leading inevitably to catastrophe. But in September 1939, those future conspiracies and catastrophes still lay ahead. For now, the generals possessed knowledge without the ability to act on it. They understood Germany's limitations, but could not alter national strategy. They recognized the approaching crisis, but could not prevent it. They were professionals serving a regime whose ambitions exceeded the nation's capacity to achieve them. And that gap between ambition and capacity would eventually consume millions of lives and destroy the nation they sought to defend. The meeting broke up with no formal conclusions or recommendations. There was nothing to recommend that would change the fundamental equation. Germany could not fight a long war. The generals understood this, but the knowledge did not translate into policy changes or strategic reorientation. Hitler's vision for German expansion could not be reconciled with economic reality. Yet Hitler's vision would continue to drive German strategy regardless of economic constraints. As the officers departed into the September afternoon, the sunlight seemed almost incongruous after the darkness of the analysis they had received. Berlin was celebrating the Polish victory, unaware of the economic vulnerabilities that victory had revealed. The public saw German strength and Allied weakness. They did not see the resource calculations, the production comparisons, the timeline showing when German stockpiles would be exhausted. Halder and Thomas remained behind after the others left, reviewing the briefing materials and discussing implications that had been left unsaid during the formal presentation.
Both men understood that they had presented analysis that contradicted official optimism about German military power. Both knew that this analysis would not be welcomed at higher levels, that suggestions of German weakness would be dismissed as defeatism or worse. Yet, as professional officers and analysts, they could not suppress their findings simply because those findings were unwelcome. The data was clear. The mathematics were simple. Germany consumed resources faster than it could produce them. This imbalance meant that Germany could win only through quick victories that prevented full Allied mobilization. Any war that lasted beyond 1941 or 1942 would see Germany overwhelmed by enemies with superior industrial capacity. The question both men contemplated but did not speak aloud was whether this realization came too late to matter. Germany was already at war with Britain and France. Hitler had made clear his intentions to expand German territory and influence. The momentum toward ever wider conflict seemed unstoppable. Even if the generals understood that Germany could not fight a long war, even if they could demonstrate this understanding with irrefutable economic analysis, could they actually change the course of events? The answer, both men suspected, was no. Recognition of limitations did not grant the power to act on that recognition. Professional military officers could analyze and advise, but political leaders determined strategy. And Hitler's strategy, driven by ideology and ambition rather than economic calculation, pointed inexorably toward the long war that Germany could not win. In the years ahead, Germany would fight that long war. Resources would be consumed, stockpiles exhausted, and production strained beyond sustainable levels. The brilliant tactics and operational excellence that had won in Poland would be applied in France, in the Soviet Union, in North Africa, in battles across Europe. German forces would win spectacular victories and inflict devastating defeats on their enemies, but ultimately they would be ground down by the superior resources of nations that could outproduce, outlast, and overwhelm German military power through sheer industrial capacity. The generals who realized in September 1939 that Germany could not fight a long war would watch that realization become reality through 6 years of conflict. They would see German armies advance to the gates of Moscow before being pushed back by Soviet forces that could replace every loss. They would see German U-boats sink millions of tons of Allied shipping, while Allied shipyards built replacements faster than submarines could sink them. They would see German cities reduced to rubble by bombing raids involving thousands of Allied aircraft that could not be effectively countered because Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce adequate fighters and the fuel to operate them. But in that September afternoon in 1939, these catastrophes were still possibilities rather than certainties, fears rather than realities. The generals left the War Ministry building knowing something crucial about Germany's strategic position, carrying an understanding that would be validated by every year of war that followed. Germany could not fight a long war. The realization had come early, based on sound analysis and professional judgment, but it had come without the power to change the course of events, at a moment when knowledge of limitations could inform tactical planning but could not alter strategic direction. The war would be long, would consume the resources that analysis predicted would be exhausted, would create the industrial imbalance that economists had forecast, would end with German defeat by enemies whose superior resources had overcome German tactical excellence. The generals knew this in September 1939, knew it with the certainty that comes from mathematical calculation and economic analysis. But knowing did not grant the ability to prevent.